The air felt heavier that night, as if it carried a secret waiting to be revealed. I had only planned to drop by my best friend's house, but instead, I found myself locked in a moment I couldn't escape. Her eyes met mine across the room. Intense, questioning, and impossible to ignore. In that instant, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I was 20 years old, fresh out of high school, and gearing up for college. My days were mostly spent with my best friend, Ethan, who had been like a brother to me since middle school. We were inseparable, spending countless afternoons at his house playing video games, studying for exams, or just hanging out. Ethan's home always felt warm and inviting, thanks in large part to his mother, Sarah. She was a striking woman, tall, with cascading auburn hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through you. Despite her beauty, it was her kindness that stood out. She had this way of making everyone feel important, always asking about your day, offering food, and genuinely listening. She worked long hours as a marketing executive, but no matter how tired she seemed, she always made time for Ethan and me. My admiration for Sarah was quiet and innocent at first. She was my best friend's mom, after all. A caring figure who occasionally joined in our conversations and shared stories about her younger days. But over time, I began to notice the little things. The way she carried herself with confidence, her infectious laughter, and how her smile could brighten even the dullest days. One afternoon, Ethan invited me over to study for our final exams. Sarah came home earlier than usual, looking effortlessly elegant in a simple dress, her hair loosely tied back. She set down her bag and joined us in the living room, joking about how she wished she could go back to the carefree days of high school. We laughed, but I found myself stealing glances at her, noticing how her presence seemed to fill the room. At that time, I didn't think much of it. She was just Sarah, Ethan's mom. But small moments like these started to linger in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of her smile, or the way her voice carried a warmth that felt both comforting and captivating. It was confusing and thrilling all at once, but I buried those thoughts, focusing instead on my friendship with Ethan and the life I was building. Yet, little did I know, those feelings were about to resurface in a way that would upend everything I thought I understood about boundaries, relationships, and myself. Let me know if you'd like to proceed or adjust anything. Things started to change subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Ethan's house, which had always been a place of casual comfort, began to feel different. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began, but every time I was there, I found myself hyper-aware of Sarah's presence. It was as though the air shifted when she walked into a room. Her voice, her laughter, even her footsteps seemed to echo louder in my mind. It didn't help that Ethan started spending less time at home. He had picked up a part-time job, which left me alone at his house more often. Sarah was usually busy with work, but on the rare occasions she was home, we'd exchange casual greetings or share brief conversations. They were innocent enough, about music, books, or the latest news, but they felt like more, like secrets shared in plain sight. One evening, I arrived earlier than usual. Ethan wasn't home yet, but Sarah was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. She wore a loose sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. It was a simple look, yet she radiated a natural elegance that caught me off guard. She turned when she noticed me standing in the doorway. "Ethan's not back yet," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "But you're welcome to wait. Can I get you anything?" I stammered something about not needing anything and quickly found my way to Ethan's room, heart pounding. That night, I couldn't focus on our usual gaming session. My mind replayed the way her eyes had lingered on me for a moment too long, the soft smile she gave before turning back to her cooking. Then came the weekend that changed everything. Ethan and his dad planned a fishing trip, leaving me without my usual plans. On a whim, I decided to stop by their house. I wasn't entirely sure why, maybe to see if Ethan had left something behind, or maybe just to see Sarah. When she opened the door, her surprise turned into a warm smile. "You just missed them," she said, stepping aside. "But you can come in if you'd like." I hesitated but eventually stepped inside. The house felt quieter than usual, almost too quiet. She poured me a glass of iced tea, and we ended up sitting in the kitchen, talking about music and movies. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew deeper. She shared stories from her youth, moments of vulnerability and joy that made her seem less like the untouchable figure I had always known and more like a real person. Time seemed to melt away. The warmth of the kitchen, the soft glow of the overhead light, and the cadence of her voice created an intimacy I hadn't expected. At one point, she reached across the table to touch my hand briefly, a casual gesture that sent a jolt through me. I felt a mix of excitement and fear, unsure of what was happening but unable to pull away. By the time I left that night, I was consumed by conflicting emotions. There was an undeniable tension between us now, something unspoken but tangible. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the boundaries between us were beginning to blur. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Every interaction with Sarah felt charged, every glance loaded with meaning. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way her eyes lingered, the subtle change in her tone when she spoke to me. It was exhilarating and terrifying, a delicate line between temptation and restraint that I wasn't sure I could walk for much longer. Ethan and his dad were still away for the weekend, leaving the house eerily quiet when I stopped by again. Sarah greeted me at the door with a surprised smile, but this time, it felt different. Her tone was softer, her gaze lingering just a second too long. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the strange flutter in my chest was just nerves. But as the evening unfolded, it became harder to ignore the unspoken tension between us. She invited me in, and we settled into the living room with mugs of tea. The warm light of the lamp illuminated her face, casting soft shadows that made her seem almost ethereal. We talked about everything and nothing, music, her work, even Ethan's childhood antics. I could tell she enjoyed sharing these moments, her laughter coming more easily, her voice carrying a warmth that felt personal. At one point, she leaned forward to adjust a photo frame on the coffee table, and her hand accidentally brushed mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shock through me. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she looked at me, her expression unreadable. My heart raced as I searched for words, but none came. The silence between us stretched, thick with something I couldn't name. "I shouldn't," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but she didn't finish. Instead, she straightened and smiled, her usual composure returning. "Let me show you something," she said, standing up and walking toward the bookshelf. She returned with an old photo album, its leather cover worn and edges frayed. We sat side by side on the couch as she flipped through the pages, sharing stories about her past. She showed me pictures of her as a teenager, laughing with friends at a school dance, her hair styled in loose curls. Her voice softened as she described the memories, and I found myself drawn in, hanging on every word. As she turned the pages, our shoulders brushed, and I became acutely aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. Her perfume was light but intoxicating, and the warmth of her presence was almost overwhelming. I tried to focus on the photos, but my gaze kept drifting to her hands, her lips, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. When the album was finished, she closed it and looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "You're a good listener," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine. There was something in her gaze, a vulnerability, a question, that made my pulse quicken. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, she leaned closer, her face inches from mine. Time seemed to stand still. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I debated what to do. Every rational thought screamed at me to pull away, to leave, but something stronger held me in place. Before I knew it, our lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if both of us were testing the waters. But then she leaned into me, her hand resting lightly on my arm, and everything else faded away. It was as if a dam had broken, unleashing emotions neither of us had fully acknowledged until that moment. Her touch was gentle but deliberate, her fingers tracing lines down my arm as if committing the moment to memory. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear, aware of the line we were crossing but powerless to stop. Each kiss, Each touch seemed to pull us deeper into a place where the outside world no longer mattered. At one point, she pulled back, her breath shallow and her eyes searching mine. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. But even as she spoke the words, she didn't move away. Instead, she rested her forehead against mine, as if caught between wanting to stop and not wanting to let go. For a moment I thought she would end it there, that reason would prevail. But then she kissed me again, more urgently this time, as if trying to silence the doubts in her mind. I lost myself in the moment, in her, until nothing else existed but the two of us. The hours that followed blurred together, a haze of forbidden touches and whispered confessions. When it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. She looked at me, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "We can't let this happen again," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew that night would change everything. It wasn't just the act itself, but what it revealed about the connection between us. A connection that, despite all logic, felt impossible to ignore. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. I woke up disoriented, my head spinning as the memories of the previous night flooded back. Sarah was still asleep beside me, her face serene, but I couldn't shake the growing knot in my stomach. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on my chest, and I knew things could never go back to the way they were. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen to get some water, my mind racing. What had we done? How could I face Ethan knowing the truth? My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chime of the doorbell. I froze, the glass of water in my hand trembling. Who could it be this early in the morning? I hesitated, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was a woman I recognized as Sarah's sister, Jenna. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw me, her gaze flickering briefly to the inside of the house before settling on me again. Is Sarah home?" she asked, her tone cautious, as if she was piecing together a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. "She's still sleeping," I stammered, feeling my face flush. Jenna's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she handed me a stack of papers. "Can you give these to her? She forgot them at my place," she said curtly before brushing past me into the house. I followed her, my heart pounding, as she made her way to the kitchen. A moment later, Sarah appeared, still in her robe, her hair tousled from sleep. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Jenna, but she quickly composed herself. "Oh, Jenna, I didn't expect you this early," she said with a forced smile. Jenna glanced between us, her expression unreadable. "I just came to drop these off," she said, her tone clipped. "I'll let you two get back to whatever you were doing." The tension in the room was suffocating as Jenna left, her departure marked by the sharp sound of the door closing. Sarah turned to me, her face pale. "We need to talk," she said quietly, gesturing for me to sit at the kitchen table. As we sat across from each other, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Sarah's eyes were filled with a mix of regret and sadness as she spoke. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But we have to move on. For Ethan. For my family." I nodded, the guilt washing over me like a tidal wave. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "But I don't know how to just forget." "We don't have a choice," she replied firmly, though her voice cracked. "No one can ever know about this. Promise me." "I promise," I said, though the words felt hollow. How could I promise to forget something that had already imprinted itself so deeply on my soul? For the rest of the day, I stayed away from Ethan's house. I couldn't face Sarah, couldn't face the memories of what had happened. But the universe seemed determined to make things worse. That evening, Ethan called, asking if I wanted to come over to hang out. His voice was cheerful, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I made up an excuse, saying I wasn't feeling well. "All right, no worries," he said, "but you should stop by tomorrow." Mom's making her famous lasagna. The thought of sitting at their dining table, pretending everything was normal, made my stomach churn. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The next day, I forced myself to go. The house felt different, as if the walls themselves were aware of what had happened. Sarah greeted me with a polite smile, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort. Ethan, oblivious as ever, was his usual self, cracking jokes and asking about my plans for the weekend. As we sat down to dinner, the tension between Sarah and me was palpable, though Ethan didn't seem to notice. But Jenna did. She arrived midway through dinner, claiming she had left something behind the day before. Her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, a knowing look flashing across her face. It was as if she could see the cracks in the facade we were trying so hard to maintain. After dinner, Jenna pulled Sarah aside, her voice low but sharp enough that I caught snippets of their conversation. "Are you sure everything's all right?" she asked. "You've been acting strange." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, her tone defensive. "You're reading too much into things." Jenna didn't look convinced, but she let it drop for now. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but the weight of her suspicion hung heavily in the air. Over the next few weeks, the strain began to take its toll. Every time I saw Sarah, it was a battle to maintain the facade, to pretend nothing had happened. But the guilt and the secrecy were suffocating. I started avoiding Ethan's house altogether, making excuses whenever he invited me over. Eventually, Ethan confronted me. "What's going on with you?" he asked one afternoon. "You've been acting weird lately. Did I do something?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It's not you. I've just been dealing with some stuff." He didn't press further, but the hurt in his eyes was clear. The distance between us grew, and I hated myself for it, but I didn't know how to fix it. Meanwhile, Sarah and I stuck to our promise. We never spoke of that night again, never even acknowledged it in passing. But the memory lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. And Jenna's suspicion never fully went away. Though she never confronted us outright, her sharp glances and probing questions were a constant reminder of the fragile ground we were treading. The truth of that night remained a secret, but it left a mark on both of us, a wound that never quite healed. It wasn't just the act itself that haunted me, but what it revealed about the choices we make, the boundaries we cross, and the consequences we carry with us long after the moment has passed. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of that night bore down on me. It wasn't just the guilt, it was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. I had betrayed Ethan, my best friend, without him ever knowing. And Sarah, she had to live with the dual burden of betraying her marriage and her son's trust. Even though we agreed never to speak of it, the silence between us screamed louder than any words ever could. Ethan noticed the change in our friendship. We no longer spent hours at his house like we used to. I avoided him at school, found excuses to turn down his invitations, and stayed far away from his home. "Are you mad at me?" he asked one day, his voice tinged with confusion and hurt. "No," I said quickly. "I've just been busy, that's all." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. The cracks in our friendship were widening, and I hated myself for it. The guilt of my actions consumed me, making it impossible to look him in the eye. Sarah, too, seemed to withdraw. When I did catch glimpses of her, at school events or when Ethan posted family pictures on social media, she looked tired, as though the secret was wearing her down. Ethan didn't seem to notice, but I could see it. She smiled less, her eyes no longer lit up the way they used to. She was a shell of the woman I had admired from afar. One evening, Ethan and I met up for coffee, a rare moment of normalcy in our strained friendship. As we sat across from each other, he leaned forward and asked, "Is everything okay with my mom? She seems different lately." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I don't know," he said, frowning. "She's been acting strange, quieter, I guess. Like something's bothering her." I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the secret that was tearing me apart. But how could I? How could I look him in the eye and admit what I had done? So instead, I shrugged and said, "Maybe she's just stressed from work." He nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. And in that moment, I realized that the fallout of that night extended far beyond me and Sarah. It was affecting Ethan, too, his family, his sense of security. And it was all my fault. As time passed, I tried to move on. I threw myself into my studies, got a part-time job, and started dating a girl from one of my classes. She was kind and funny, and for a while, I thought I could forget everything. But late at night, when I was alone with my thoughts, the memories of that night with Sarah would creep back in. I couldn't escape them. For Sarah, the consequences were even more profound. Jenna's suspicion never faded, and though she never confronted Sarah outright, the tension between them was palpable. Ethan's dad, oblivious to the truth, remained his cheerful self, but Sarah's withdrawal created a rift in their marriage. Ethan confided in me one day that his parents had been arguing more than usual, though he didn't know why. "I think my mom's unhappy," he said, his voice filled with worry. "But she won't talk to me about it." I didn't know what to say. How could I comfort him when I was part of the reason for her unhappiness? All I could do was nod and mumble something about how relationships were complicated. Eventually, Ethan and I drifted apart. The weight of the secret, the distance I had created between us, it was too much to overcome. We stopped hanging out, stopped texting, until one day I realized it had been months since we had spoken. Our friendship, once so strong, was now just a memory. Sarah and I never spoke again either. The last time I saw her was at a school reunion years later. She was there with Ethan and his dad, smiling politely but looking distant. When our eyes met across the room, there was a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the past. But neither of us made a move to speak. We both knew there was nothing left to say. In the end, the fallout of that night left scars on all of us. It wasn't just the guilt or the broken friendships. It was the way it changed me. I realized how easy it was to cross lines I had once thought inviolable, how one moment of weakness could ripple outward and affect the lives of everyone around me. Even now, years later, I carry the weight of that night. It shaped the way I see relationships, the way I value trust and boundaries. And though I've tried to move on, to build a life untainted by that one mistake, the memory remains. A reminder of the price of betrayal and the fragility of the connections we hold dear. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memory of it still lingers in the quiet moments, like a shadow that refuses to fade. I've tried to move forward, to build a life rooted in trust and honesty, but the lessons of that time remain etched into who I am. They serve as a painful reminder of the choices we make and the consequences they carry, not just for ourselves but for everyone around us. I never reconnected with Ethan. Our friendship, once unshakable, became a casualty of my betrayal. Every now and then, I'll see a glimpse of him on social media. A picture of him with his wife, smiling at some family gathering, or a post about a new milestone in his life. I'm happy for him, truly, but there's a pang of regret that accompanies every photo, a silent acknowledgement of the bond one destroyed and can never rebuild. Sarah's life moved on, too, though I can't imagine it was easy for her. The last I heard, she and Ethan's dad had separated. Whether or not our secret played a role, I'll never know. But I like to think she's found some peace, some way to forgive herself for that night. I hope she's learned to let go of the guilt that once weighed her down, even if I haven't fully managed to do the same. Looking back, I've come to realize that the greatest betrayal wasn't just what happened between Sarah and me. It was the way we both ignored the ripple effects of our actions. I betrayed my best friend, a man who trusted me like a brother. She betrayed her marriage, a foundation built on vows and trust. And together, we created a secret that fractured relationships far beyond our own. But more than anything, that night taught me about the power of temptation and the importance of boundaries. It's so easy to tell yourself, it's just one moment. It won't matter, but moments have a way of growing, of taking root and spreading until they consume everything you thought you could control. Now, in my own relationships, I hold on to that lesson like a lifeline. I've learned to value honesty, to recognize when I'm walking too close to a line I shouldn't cross. And though I've made mistakes since then, as we all do, I've never allowed myself to forget what happens when you let those mistakes define you. If I could go back, I'd change everything. I'd respect the boundaries that seemed so easy to ignore in the heat of the moment. I'd value the friendships and trust one took for granted. But life doesn't offer do-overs, only lessons, and it's up to us to make those lessons count. When I think of Sarah now, it's not with longing or regret but with a quiet sadness. She was someone I admired, someone who showed me a side of myself I wasn't ready to confront. But she was also someone who made a mistake just like I did. And while our paths will never cross again, I hope she's found her own peace, her own resolution. As for me, I've learned to carry the weight of that night without letting it crush me. It's a part of my story, a chapter one can't erase, but it doesn't define who I am. What defines me is what I've chosen to do with it, the way I've grown, the way I've learned to value trust and integrity above all else. In the end, that night wasn't just a moment of passion or betrayal. It was a turning point, a moment that forced me to face the darkest parts of myself and decide who I wanted to be. And while I can't change the past, I can strive to be better in the future. A promise I've made to myself and to those I love. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Could you have walked away? Or would you have been swept up in the moment like I was? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complex, messy, and deeply human sides of relationships. Trust me, the next one will leave you speechless.